The notice went up on Ada Pruitt's door on a Tuesday, and by Friday half of Cottonwood Bend had found a reason to stand along the road where her fence met the town lots. It was April of 1883, and the Montana mud still held the print of every wheel that had turned since the thaw. Vernon Sloat came out from town in a black buggy with a folded paper riding in his breast pocket. He stepped down into the road, and he did not trouble himself with a greeting. "Get those hives off my land," he said. Ada stood in the dooryard with the straw skep held against her chest. It had ridden from Missouri on her lap 7 years before, a coil of rye straw her mother had sown, and the bees inside it were the granddaughters of her mother's bees. Behind her, crated to a box on the wagon bed, sat her 12 bee gums, the hollow lengths of cottonwood her husband had cut and capped the first winter on the claim. "This quarter was proved up," she said. "Tom filed on it in '78. The papers are in the house. The papers are worthless." Sloat drew the folded sheet from his coat and thrust it toward her face, close enough that she had to turn her head. Odd-numbered section. "Railroad grant land, every acre of it, and your husband's filing was never good for 1 day of the 6 years you sat on it. The company has sold this quarter, and the buyer wants it cleared by Saturday. My husband is buried on this quarter. Then he can stay." A wind moved down the road and worried the shawls of the women in front of the mercantile. Sloat half turned toward the porch, and when he spoke again, he pitched it loud enough to carry to the far end of the street. "Look at this, all of you. A widow and a wagon-load of bugs standing in the road of a county's progress. Take your bugs, madam, and take your begging with them. To some town the railroad hasn't bought." Somebody laughed, one short laugh from the shade of the porch, and nobody claimed it. Effa Cobb, who kept the mercantile with her husband, watched from the top step with her arms folded. Pearl Dandridge, the postmistress, stood next to her and did not fold hers. Ada set the skep on the wagon seat. She walked back for the smoker and the hive tools and the box of empty jars, and she loaded them without hurry while the whole of Cottonwood Bend watched her do it, and she did not give the porch her face. When the last crate was roped, she climbed up beside the skep and took the lines, and the team stood in the road with no place on earth to be pointed. She was still sitting there when Silas Odell came out of the feed store with a sack of oats on his shoulder. He was a rancher from south of town, 41 years old, a big, quiet man who paid cash and was gone, and Ada knew him the same distance everybody knew him. He set the sack in his wagon, looked at her team, looked at the crates, and crossed the road. "You got ground for those," he said. It was barely a question. "Not yet. I've got a south slope above Alder Creek, sweet clover to the fence line, and nothing working it but grasshoppers." She looked down at him from the seat. He stood bareheaded in the mud with his hat in his hand, not out of courtliness, it seemed, but because he had forgotten it was in his hand. "I can't pay grazing on bees," she said. "Didn't ask you to. My cook quit in March. Me and my hired man have been living out of a fry pan since, and Dutch burns everything but the coffee, and he burns the coffee. There's a room off the kitchen with a door that bolts and a window that looks at the creek. Cooking and washing till spring, board in it, and a slope for your bees." The porch was listening. He knew the porch was listening, and he let it. "Bees need somewhere," he said. "So do you. I keep the honey. Sell it, eat it, feed it to the dog. It's yours." Ada looked once at the house with the notice on the door, and once at the low-rise past the garden where a wooden cross stood inside a little whitewashed fence, and then at the man in the mud. Then we have an arrangement, Mr. Odell. He put his hat on. We do, Mrs. Pruitt. The ride to the Odell place ran 7 miles, and neither of them spent a word on it. He tied his saddle horse behind and drove her team himself, and she sat with the skep on her knees and her hands quiet on the straw. The town fell away behind them. Meadowlarks went up out of the ditch grass, the low hum of the crated bees rode under the creak of the wheels, and at the Alder Creek ford he slowed the team to a walk without being asked, so the crossing wouldn't jar the combs loose. She noticed that. She did not remark on it, and he did not look over to see whether she had noticed, and the wagon came up out of the water and went on. The house was log below and sawn lumber above, tight-built, bare as a bachelor's Sunday. The room off the kitchen held a rope bed, a washstand, and a nail for her coat. She stood in the doorway a moment, then hung the coat on the nail, and that was her moving in. All of it. Supper that first night was biscuits, salt pork and cream gravy, and a dried apple pie, because she had found the apples going soft in a barrel and could not abide waste. Dutch, the hired man, was 60 if he was a day, with a mustache that had outlived 3 razors. He took 1 biscuit, and then a second before the first was rightly swallowed. "Ma'am, I'd marry you for this biscuit alone, if I was the marrying kind," he said. "Eat your supper, Dutch," Silas said. "I am eating it. That's my whole point." Ada set the pan back on the stove. "There's more." Dutch buttered his third and pointed it at the window, toward the dark where the slope lay. "Them bees now. They know you, personal. They know my hands and they know my smoke. They'd know yours inside a week if you moved slow and quit swatting. I swat, ma'am. I'm a swatting man. 60-odd years of swatting behind me. Then keep to the horses." Silas looked up from his plate for the first time. "That slope carry enough bloom for 12 hives?" For 12 and 40 more worked right. 40 in time. Bees pay a patient keeper and ruin a hasty one. He appeared to turn that over the same as he would a colt's bad foot, and gave it 1 nod and went back to his plate. Beyond that he said nothing at the table except to pass what was asked for. He ate 4 biscuits and 2 wedges of the pie, and when he was done he stood, took his hat off the peg, and stopped in the door. "Obliged, ma'am." That was the whole of his speech, and he went out to the barn with the lantern, and Ada washed the dishes in a kitchen that already felt less like a stranger's than the road had. In the morning she set her 12 gums and the skep in 2 rows on the south slope, facing sunrise, with the creek below them and the clover coming on green. Silas watched from the corral rail a long while, saying nothing. When she came down the slope he had already turned back to his colts, and whatever he thought of, bugs he kept between himself and the horses. She had said at supper one evening, to Dutch's asking, and not to Silas at all, that log gums were a poor way to winter bees this far north, that a woman who meant to stay in the business would want proper board hives with movable frames, and that lumber cost what it cost. It was table talk. She thought no more about it. 2 weeks later she walked up the slope with her smoker and found cedar stacked beside the gums, split billets, straight-grained, knot-free, sawn and riven to box lengths, enough for a dozen hives and some over. There was no note, because there was no need of one, and no one else in the county who split cedar that clean. She built the boxes in the evenings on the porch, and Silas sat at the other end of the porch mending harness, and an hour would go by with no sound between them but her playing and his all. "Cedar splits clean," she said one night. "It does." he said. That was the entire conversation, and both of them seemed to find it sufficient. In June the clover came on so heavy, the slope droned like a church organ from morning to dark, and she pulled her first calm of the year, white, capped, and full. She cut the finest section into a jar, and in the morning, while the men were at the corral, she set that jar on the sill of the kitchen window, the deep outside sill above the wash bench where Silas shaved of a morning with a bit of mirror hung on a nail. She said nothing about it. He said nothing about it. But the jar emptied by Sunday, and it came back to the kitchen shelf washed. And she filled it and set it out again, and all that summer the jar traveled its small circuit, sill to sill, and neither of them ever once spoke of it out loud. Other things passed between them the same silent road. The hinge on her door had squalled since April. She came in from the yard one day, and it swung behind her without a sound, the pins bright with fresh grease. Her smoker bellows split along the fold. 2 days on, it was stitched with harness leather, saddler's work, tight as new. His good coat hung by the door with a sleeve torn half out of it for a month. One Monday it hung there whole. The seam laid so fine he wore it 2 days before he knew. She kept a tin can of sweet clover and prairie roses on the supper table, changed fresh every few days. And Dutch remarked on the flowers twice and got no answer from anybody, and quit remarking. In town that summer, the porch had its own accounting to do. Living out at Odell's since April, Effa Cobb said, weighing out coffee. No ring on her hand. I'll say that much and no more. You've said it 4 times this week, Pearl Dandridge said. She cooks for wages, Effa, same as any man hires on for haying. A man hires men. He hired Dutch, and Dutch is nearer a fossil than a man, said old Otho Finch from the checkerboard by the stove. He ran the livery and had known Effa 60 years. You never once let a fact stand in the road of a good disapproval, Effa, not once in my hearing. And what would you have had her do? Pearl said. The agent put her off her own ground in front of this whole street. Did anybody here offer her a spare room that morning? Did you? I might have, had I been asked. Nobody knocks on a closed face. Effa tied off the coffee sack and found no answer to that, which the porch agreed afterward was a sight worth the walk over. Otho bought a jar of the Odell Slope honey every week without fail. Best sweetening this town has seen since the war, he told the porch generally. I don't care where the woman hangs her coat. The honey sold. It sold out, in fact, every load she brought in, and by August Effa Cobb had quit pretending otherwise. Bring me double come Saturday, she said across her counter, in the tone of a woman granting a favor, and I'll not quarrel over your price. You'll have your double, Ada said, and that was the longest transaction the 2 women had that whole summer, and both went away counting it a profit. In September, Ada rendered her cappings and dipped candles, straight and honey-colored, and they burned slower than tallow and smelled of summer instead of sheep fat. And Pearl put 2 in the post office window with the whole town past them. Nobody on the porch called them bugs anymore. The porch had not decided anything out loud. Porches never do. But the ledger was turning a page at a time. The court of Sloat had cleared her off of, sat empty all that season. The buyer, whoever the buyer had been, never broke ground. The grass grew up through the garden Ada had left, and the notice on the door faded to gray. And men driving past could see the little whitewashed fence on the rise standing in wild oats. Nobody said much about that either. It was noticed. The cold that year did not come gradual. The second week of November, it came down off the high country like a dropped blade. 30 below by the third night, and it shut the passes and drifted the rail cuts west of town full to the crowns. The freight that carried the mercantile sugar, its coffee, its lamp oil, and most of its winter comfort sat somewhere east of the divide for 19 days. By the 1st of December, Ethel Cobb's shelves held neither a pound of sugar nor a gallon of oil, and she papered the empty window and stopped explaining it to people. Then the croup came through the school. It went child to child down the benches, a barking cough that sounded like a dog in a well, worst in the small hours when a house is coldest. Doc Tillman drove his cutter from door to door and slept in it between doors, and what he told every mother was the same. Steam from a kettle, keep the child upright, keep the child warm, and honey in hot water, spooned slow and often, to ease the throat and quiet the cough so the little ones could sleep. It was what he had, and the mercantile had been out of sugar for a week and a half, and there was exactly one place in that county where honey sat by the hundredweight. The knock came on the Odell door at 11 at night, and it was Pearl Dandridge, snow to her knees, a lantern nearly dry in her hand. "It's Chester," she said. "My grandson. He can't get his breath ahead of the cough, and Doc Tillman says honey and hot water, and Effa's shelves are bare, and I have stood in my kitchen for an hour telling myself you had no reason on this earth to open this door to anybody from that porch." "Come in out of that," Ada said. Silas was already up and pulling his boots on, no word to anyone, and by the time Ada had a crate packed, 2 jars of honey, a candle bundle, a square of comb for the boy to suck, the sleigh was hitched and standing at the door with the lanterns lit. "What do I owe you?" Pearl said. "Nothing tonight. Sit down by the stove for 5 minutes first. You're no use to Chester Frozen." 3 days later, Pearl sent word up with the mail rider that the boy was sleeping through till daylight. And after Pearl, the knocking never rightly stopped. The Kirby man stood in the doorway with his hat going around and around in his hands. "We've got 3 down with it out on the flat," he said. "And I'd best say it plain, ma'am. I've got $2 to carry us to Spring, and that's the sum of it. Then you've still got $2. Take the jars and bring them back empty. That's the price." "That's no price at all. Bring them back in August full of whatever your wife cans then, and we'll call it square. Go on home before that team stiffens." The schoolteacher came for the 3 children boarded with her, and left with candles besides, because half the town's lamps were dry by then and the freight no nearer the divide. The Finch house came, and the Aldersons and families Ada knew only by their fences, and they all went home with honey for the cough and beeswax light for the long dark. The church held its Advent evenings by her candles. Doc Tillman himself sat in the Odell kitchen past midnight more than once that winter, thawing his hands around a cup. "You'll give yourself out at this rate," he told her. "Honey and candles both, and no end of it in sight. There's better than 400 pounds in that cellar, Doc, and if the cough runs into February, then February can come see what the cellar's for. You keep sending them. I never yet met anybody who kept books like a church does," he said, "and I've quit expecting to understand it. I'll keep sending them." And he said later, in the hearing of the whole mercantile porch, that every child in Cottonwood Bend who got ahead of that cough got ahead of it on her honey and somebody's prayers, and that he had prescribed both and would again. Ethel Cobb came out herself, the last of them, near Christmas. She stood on the step with her breath smoking and a covered basket on her arm like a woman paying a call she had rehearsed. "I have said things about you," Ethel said, "in my store, on my porch. I expect some of them walked out here ahead of me. They did. Come in, Ethel, it's cold." Ethel came in and drank the coffee she was poured, and set the basket on the table and uncovered a smoked ham. "From our own smokehouse," she said. "I'll not carry it home again, so your objections can save themselves the trip. Then I thank you for it. And come spring, I want first claim on your candle lots." The church board asked me to put in for them, and I said I would, and now I have. She stood and gathered her shawl and looked around the warm kitchen a moment. "Well," she said. Well, and that was as near as Ethel Cobb ever came to an apology in her whole life, and Ada took it for the entire thing it was, and from the 1st of January forward there was no steadier friend to the Odell kitchen in the town of Cottonwood Bend, nor a louder one. The bees wintered well in their cedar boxes, packed in straw, and on the still afternoons Ada walked the rows and laid her bare palm flat on each hive lid, and where the wood breathed a faint warmth up into her hand, she moved on satisfied. Silas walked up with her sometimes, hands in his pockets, and learned the trick of it, palm to the lid, listening through his skin. He never asked her to explain, and she never offered, and the two of them would stand in the blue snowlight among the quiet hives longer than any errand required. Christmas morning there was a package on the kitchen table wrapped in brown paper, and inside it a bee veil of black tulle sewn to a wide brim hat, store-bought, ordered from Helena sometime in the fall, which meant sometime before the freeze, which meant he had thought of it back when the porch was still deciding what she was. She wore it into the yard every fine day after. She never thanked him in words, and the loaf of gingerbread that appeared in his saddlebag when he rode to the stock meeting was never mentioned by either party. The thaw came in late March, and the mud came with it, and up the Odell Lane through that mud came a black buggy Ada knew before she could see the man's face. She was in the bee yard with her veil thrown back, cracking the first hive of the afternoon. Vernon Sloat left the buggy at the gate and picked his town boots through the yard mud, and Silas at the corral. Set down the halter he was mending and came up the slope and stopped a pace behind her right shoulder and stood. Mrs. Pruitt Sloat took off his hat this time. "You've landed on your feet. The whole territory hears about it. Honey to 3 towns, candles in the churches, the sick raised up out of their beds. Remarkable, you've come 7 miles through the mud to admire me. I've come with an offer." He drew out papers, and this time he held them at a respectful distance. "The company sees a future in apiary products along the line. Freight access, city markets, St. Paul, Chicago. I'm authorized to buy your outfit whole. $60 a hive, every hive, and to put you on a company salary to run the yards. More cash money than this county sees in a year, and you'd keep your bees. No, you haven't heard the terms. I heard them. No, every hive, Mrs. Pruitt, cash on signing. Name a figure above 60 if it suits your pride better. It isn't pride, Mr. Sloat, and there isn't a figure." Sloat's jaw worked once. He looked past her shoulder. "Odell, you're a businessman. Talk sense to her." "She talks her own sense," Silas said, and moved not 1 inch from where he stood. "Bugs, madam," Sloat's voice thinned. "You are refusing real money over a wagon load of bugs. I said so in the road last spring, and I'll stand by it. You said it loud, as I recall. You wanted the whole street to hear you say it." Ada set the hive tool down on the lid and folded her hands, and her voice never rose at all. "Those bugs lit this town through December, Mr. Sloat. They eased every croup cough in it, mine given free, and the town's word on that, not mine. You cleared me off a quarter your buyer never wanted, and my husband lies on it yet, in grass gone wild because progress had somewhere better to be. The town remembers all of it. So do I. My bees are not for sale, and I am not for hire. Good day to you." For a moment it seemed he would argue with her, and then it seemed he understood in the manner of a man reading a document that there was no clause in her anywhere he could attach to. He set the hat back on his head and picked his way down through the mud, and his wheels spun twice at the gate before they caught, and no one laughed from any porch. But 200 bees rose off the front hive and hung in the air behind him partway down the lane, a thin golden escort, and Dutch swore to the end of his days that they saw the man clear to the section line. Silas had not moved. Ada picked up the hive tool. "You could have said something," she said. "You weren't needing anything said." They worked the rest of the row together, him lifting the lids off ahead of her, and the yard hummed around them both, and that was all the discussing that offer ever got. 3 weeks on, in April, on the first true flying day of the year, 1 year almost to the Tuesday since the notice had gone up on her door, Silas came up the slope in the late afternoon with his hat in his hand again, and this time it did not look forgotten there. Ada was kneeling at the skep, the old one, her mother's rye straw gone silver, watching the young bees make their first wobbling circles against the sun. "Ada," she looked up. He had never once used her Christian name. She stood and pushed the veil back off her face. "A year ago I stood in the road and told you bees need somewhere," he said. It was true, and it was also the most words I knew how to put in front of a woman in the middle of a street. I've had a year to find better ones, and I haven't found many. So, marry me. The hum went on all down the slope. Ada looked at him for the space of 3 breaths. "You've got cooking and washing already," she said. "A wife comes dearer. I'm not asking for a cook. I'm asking if you want a home. Yours, your name set next to mine on everything I own. And the South Slope deeded to you outright whichever answer you give, that part's done. It's at the courthouse. It isn't in the bargain. There's no Saturday on this offer, and no man alive can clear you off it." She looked down the rows of hives, cedar he had split, on ground he was giving whether or not she gave him anything back. And then she looked at the big patient man standing in the clover with his hat against his leg. "You'd be taking on bees in the bargain," she said. 100 hives some day in your dooryard, and me smelling of smoke 6 months of the year. "I split cedar all one spring for a woman who never asked me to," he said. "I know what I'm asking for." "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and put his hat on careful, the crown dented where his hand had been gripping it. They stood among the bees, not touching, a foot of April air between them, and by supper time nothing about the kitchen looked different, and everything was. Dutch took the news with a nod, reached for a third biscuit, and said, "Took the pair of you a full year." I had it reckoned at 8 months. They were married the 2nd week of June, when the clover bloom came on, in the church that had kept its advent by her candles. Pearl Dandridge stood up with Ada, and Epha Cobb wept in the second pew loudly enough to be depended upon, and afterward on the church steps Otho Finch pressed both her hands and told her Cottonwood Bend had been a long while owing her a good day like this one. Chester Dandridge, breathing easy since December, carried her flowers, sweet clover and prairie roses out of a tin can at his own solemn request. That same summer Silas rode to Helena and came home with a paper, and did not present it to her so much as leave it on the kitchen table under the flour can, which was by then how anything that mattered got delivered in that house. It was a deed. He had bought the old quarter back from the railroad company at grazing land price, the buyer having long since evaporated, and the company having discovered, with Sloat no longer in its employ by then, that spite pays no dividend. They ran heifers on the grass, and Ada kept the little fence on the rise whitewashed, and Tom Pruitt lay from that day forward on land no agent could ever put a paper against, and if it struck anyone in the county as strange, a man securing his wife's first husband's grave, nobody said so where Ada could hear, because the town had long since finished revising its opinion of what went on at the Odell place. The years went by the quiet road that good years go. The 12 gums became 40 cedar hives, and the 40 became 140 yards on 3 creeks, and the honey went out under the Alder Creek label to towns Ada never saw, on the same rails that had once been the excuse for turning her out. Doc Tillman never wrote a prescription for a winter cough without asking first whether there was Odell honey in the house, and there generally was. Effa Cobb sold it over her counter to the end of her days and told every stranger the whole story unasked. "Bugs," she would say, and slap the counter flat. The man stood in that road with his paper and called them bugs. And I stood on my own porch and let him. You remember that part, because I make sure of it. Chester Dandridge hired on at 16 as her yard man and stayed 20 years. I owe this yard a debt from when I was small, he said the day he asked for the work, solemn as a deacon, and I mean to work it off at fair wages. Silas grew gray at the temples and no louder. Ada's hands grew wise the slow way hands do, and the two of them still walked the winter rows together, palms flat to the hive lids, feeling for the warmth. If 20 years of marriage had a sum, it was not an anything either of them ever said in company, because they were not company people. It was in a smaller thing, kept where it had always been kept. The first jar, the one from that first June, had never left its circuit. Sill to shelf to sill, emptied and washed and filled again from the first white comb of every summer for 20 years, standing on the deep outside ledge above the wash bench where a quiet man shaved of a morning. Visitors took it for a jar of honey, and it was one. It was also the first thing he had ever been given without asking, by a woman the whole town had watched be told to take her bugs and beg elsewhere. And on June evenings, when the light came long up the valley from the creek, it caught that light and held it, gold lit from the inside, right where she had first set it down, on his sill.